Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. On this all-new weekly episode of our Stories from Maine podcast, we shall hear the true story of a young girl who dared to break the stalemate of the Cold War, softened the heart of the great Soviet bear, and worked to bring two adversarial nations closer to peace. Stay with us and hear the incredible story of Maine's own, legendary ambassador of peace, Samantha Smith. Our Stories from Maine podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine weekly podcast for the last week of March 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. You can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And now, you can also find Stories from Maine on TikTok. Now, let's head over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this segment of This Week in Maine History, we continue to celebrate Women's History Month, as we look back to April 4th of 1804, when Dorothea Lynde Dix was born in Hampton, Maine. Dix would go on to become a major advocate for the treatment and conditions of the sick, injured, and mentally ill in America's hospitals and institutions. Dix would also go on to head a new arm of the Union government during the American Civil War, when she accepts an appointment as superintendent of nurses for the Union Army. Dix would structure a new female corps of nurses, set the bar of treatment and care for sick and wounded soldiers, and create a standard of care in nursing that is still in place today in the field of modern nursing. Now, let's head on over to Oscar for our feature story of Maine's legendary Cold War ambassador of peace, Samantha Smith.
In 1945, the defeat of Nazi Germany, which ended World War II in Europe, saw the victorious Soviet Union and the war-winning United States both emerge as world superpowers. Both nations would go on to dominate the future of Europe. The political tensions which ensued between the Communist Soviet Union and the Democratic United States caused a tense and confrontational conflict, commonly called the Cold War, which then dominated the world for the next 40 years. By the 1980s, this Cold War saw an aggressive spread of communism and democratic nation building, along with a dramatic weapons race, which threatened the possibility of another world war and a potential for nuclear annihilation. As tensions between the two superpowers seemed endless, most world inhabitants prayed for a return to sanity and a fully realized global peace. In 1982, Samantha Smith was just 10 years old when her anxieties over World War came to a head. In November of that year, while most in America were busy with planning their Thanksgiving celebrations, Smith wrote a letter that would become world-renowned, would alter the trajectory of her life, and catapult her to fame and adoration. Smith's letter was penned to Soviet leader Yuri Andropov, and her correspondence was simple in its intent. She asked the hardline Russian General Secretary if he planned a war with the United States, and why he would want to do that. It was a simple question, and it echoed what so many the world over also wanted to know. Smith's letter was soon published in the Soviet Union's Pravda newspaper. Smith's innocent letter found popular acclaim with the Soviet people, and the letter was reprinted by newspapers the world over. Word of the popularity of her letter soon reached Smith at her home in Manchester, Maine. By April of 1983, A reply had arrived in Smith's mail, and the letter was complete with a Soviet postmark. Yuri Andropov, reportedly a vicious and ruthless ruler, had written back to Smith. In Andropov's response, he explained that it was not the desire of the Soviet people or of their Soviet leaders to have a war of any size with anyone, and he explained that the desire of the Russian people was for peace. Andropov went on in his letter to allay Smith's fears, and he closed his letter with an invitation for Smith and her family to visit the Soviet Union as his guest. When we return, Samantha takes Andropov up on his offer and finds popularity and fame. We'll be right back.
We hope you are enjoying our weekly podcast. Please take a moment to subscribe to Stories from Maine on our YouTube and Spotify channels. And you can follow Stories from Maine on our Facebook page, where over 40,000 followers enjoy our daily content. Please help us by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting to our content on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. Now, let's return to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
On April 6 of 1945, one of the greatest poets in American history dies at the age of 65. Born at Alna, Maine on December 22 of 1869, Edward Arlington Robinson grew up in Gardiner, on the banks of the Kennebec River. Robinson would eventually leave Maine to live in New York City, where he focused on writing poetry. Robinson's poems would go on to receive great acclaim, and Robinson would become a three-time recipient of the famed Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Today, Edward Arlington Robinson is considered one of the greatest poets of the 20th century. Now, let's go back to Oscar for more of our feature story.
By July of 1983, Smith boarded a plane with her parents, and amid a fast-paced flurry of media attention, were bound for what many referred to as the evil empire of the Soviet Union. The nonstop media coverage in the United States became a two-edged blade. Some heralded the young Smith and her correspondence as a virtuous venture and a peacemaking gesture of goodwill and diplomacy. Some naysayers wrote off the whole matter as a mere Russian propaganda event, usurping this young girl's naive idealism. Either way, the firestorm of media attention launched Smith into the national spotlight as she appeared in newspapers, television news programs, and nighttime talk shows. By the time Smith and her family embarked on their flight to the Soviet Union, Samantha Smith had already become a bona fide American celebrity and a grassroots citizen diplomat. The relentless media frenzy and the following public scrutiny left behind the Smiths in the United States was only a taste of what was to come, as a comparison firestorm of press attention only signaled what still awaited the Smiths' arrival in Russia. When the Smiths' plane landed in the evil Soviet Empire, Smith was met not only by media, but by many diplomats, Soviet citizens, and adoring admirers. For the next 2 weeks, Samantha visited Moscow, Leningrad, Artek, and many other communities in Russia, and she met many people who welcomed her and showed her a true friendliness and warmth, which convinced the young American that the people of the Soviet Union were very much like the people in the United States. And for those who met her in Russia, she was greeted as a comrade and as a true friend. Although she was able to meet a number of Soviet dignitaries and a female Soviet cosmonaut, Samantha was not able to meet with Yuri Andropov himself, as he was said to be sick and unable to travel. By the end of the Smiths' 2 weeks in the Soviet Union, Samantha and her family made preparations to return home to the United States. For the young Smith, her nuclear anxieties were finally allayed, and her fears of Soviet unfriendliness were totally put to rest. Her trip did more to ease apocalyptic fears worldwide than had any political speech or détente-like peace accord that had thus far taken place. The entire trip was a virtual olive branch for peace and goodwill relations, one which could be built upon and expanded by official diplomats and politicians from both nations. We'll be right back.
Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell, whose books, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through all retail booksellers and can also be found on Amazon. And her Stories from Maine weekly article, in the Mid-Coast Maine newspaper, The Times Record, can be found on newsstands each Friday. Keep up with Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And you can contact us with comments or suggestions by emailing storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. Now, let's go back to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
On April 7 of 2010, the Maine legislature officially condemned an illegal and racially motivated state action, which occurred 100 years earlier. And in 2011, Maine Governor John Baldacci also issued a formal apology for this forced eviction of a black and biracial community living on a small island off the coast of Phippsburg. These Malaga residents were a community of hardworking and independent people who were cast out of their homes in 1911. The racially motivated relocation saw over 45 of these black and biracial inhabitants committed to the Pineland Hospital for the mentally incompetent in New Gloucester, in order for the state to take possession of the 42-acre privately owned island. This state eviction also included the re-internment of 17 bodies from the Malaga Island Cemetery. Today, a monument to these Malagaites reminds visitors of this shameful state action and tells the sad story of these poor and unjustly displaced Malaga people. Now, let's go back to Oscar for more of our feature story.
When the Smiths arrived back home in Maine, the celebrity that had begun before the trip only continued back home. Samantha was then invited by the Japanese Prime Minister to visit Japan, where Samantha took part in an international children's symposium. By 1985, Samantha also wrote a book called Journey to the Soviet Union, telling her story of her experiences in Japan and Russia. Smith's celebrity soon grew into more of entertainment-based fame than that of a diplomatic distinction. Smith soon emerged in a number of television appearances, which led to her being invited to test for an acting part as a recurring cast member in a new ABC television program called Lime Street.
About what happened today, I was wondering, what do you know about that?
Everything.
Everything?
Sure. I've seen all the films in PE, and I've talked to the school nurse, and I've read most of the recommended books on puberty, menstruation, and reproduction.
Well, that's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm proud of you.
Proud?
Well, yes, you're so grown up. I hadn't noticed.
Thanks, Grandpa.
By the time filming had begun, Smith was just 13 years old, and she had already gained an international reputation. Once filming began, her fame had led her from international politics to one of a budding Hollywood star. In the television series, Smith's co-star was Hollywood screen and television legend Robert Wagner, who played Smith's on-screen dad. By late summer in 1985, 4 episodes of Lime Street had been filmed in London, England, and Samantha was looking forward to a brief return to her home in Manchester, Maine. On August 25th of 1985, Smith and her real-life dad, Arthur, had boarded a plane in England, bound for the rocky coast of Maine. They first landed at Boston's Logan International Airport, where they climbed on board a Bar Harbor Airlines flight bound for Auburn, Maine. It was approximately 10 o'clock in the evening when the small plane approached the Auburn airport. In a light rain, and with confused instrument readings, the pilot struggled to maintain proper altitude. Suddenly, the flight crashed on approach to the runway. All 8 people on board the flight, including Samantha and her father Arthur, were killed on impact. For her short time on Earth, and in just 3 years of her life, Samantha Smith had made a remarkable impact on the world. Her innocent inquisitiveness led her to write to one of the most feared and powerful of world leaders, which opened a new and fresh line of international diplomacy that helped to foster a more positive attitude between the peoples of the United States and those of the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of her sudden and tragic loss, both words of grief and sadness came from American President Ronald Reagan, new Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, and many others, all praising Smith and her positive effects on the Cold War. Memorials and remembrances were soon after created in Smith's memory, both in the United States and in the Soviet Union. And now, the legacy of Maine's own Samantha Smith are remembered in a post-Cold War era and in the legendary annals of our Stories from Maine.
Please help us keep Maine's history alive and free to enjoy by liking, sharing, following, commenting, and subscribing to our content on social media. Our Stories from Maine podcast episodes stream each Saturday on our YouTube and Spotify channels. So, please come back next week for another all-new episode of our Stories from Maine. See you then.
All original Stories from Maine content is copyright 2025, with all rights reserved. Our Stories from Maine logo is a registered trademark of Lori Suzanne Dell. No portion of this program may be reproduced, in any form, without the express permission of Stories from Maine. To contact us, email storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.